Okay, so now we have to talk about the white blood cells or leukocytes. Okay, these are the least abundant formed elements, but they are something that we cannot live without. Okay, and they are formed from hemocytoblasts in the bone marrow, just like the red blood cells. They contain a nuclei, whereas remember the red blood cells, the mature red blood cells, do not have a nuclei. And there are about 4,500 to 10,000 per millimeter cubed within your blood. White blood cell count increases whenever the cells encounter disease-causing organisms or chemicals. Okay, so they are the ones that help you protect against infection and diseases. And there are several different kinds because each kind of works specifically against certain things. So we are going to go through them and talk about their characteristics and where we find them, how abundant they are, things like that. So white blood cells function to provide defense against disease organisms and promote and decrease inflammatory responses. They also perform functions within tissues. They can migrate from blood into tissue. Cells then follow a chemical trail to the site of damage. So if you get a cut or you get an infection, the white blood cells are called out to that location to try to help your body heal. Okay? There are two broad categories of leukocytes. Granulocytes, which possess cytoplasmic granules. These are the neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. And agranulocytes, and these lack cytoplasmic granules. These are the lymphocytes and monocytes. And they actually look different, and we're going to see that. The first one we're going to talk about is the neutrophil. And this is the most abundant of the white blood cells, composing 60 to 70%. The nucleus is clearly visible when it's stained and typically consists of 3 to 5 lobes connected by a slender nuclear strand. And this is how you can differentiate in a blood smear which cell is which, because they each look differently within the stain. So the neutrophil would have 3 to 5 lobes, and that would be your clue that you were looking at a neutrophil. So they are the first white blood cell to respond to any kind of tissue damage. And when they get there, they start performing phagocytosis, which is encapsulating basically anything that shouldn't be there. And they release the enzyme lysozyme. And this helps in cleaning up whatever is wrong. The primary task is to destroy bacteria, and the number increases when you have an acute infection. The eosinophil. These are harder to find in a blood film because there's not as many of them. They're only 2 to 4% of the total white blood cell count. They have a bilobed nucleus with red staining granules. They function to neutralize histamine, so they deal with allergic reactions. And they also deal with if you get some type of parasitic worm. They also would be called in for that. They also deal with collagen diseases and diseases of the spleen and central nervous system. Although they are not super prevalent in the blood, they are abundant in mucous membranes of the respiratory, digestive, and lower urinary tracts. Eosinophils secrete chemicals that weaken or destroy relatively large parasites such as hookworms and tapeworms, because those are too big for any of the white blood cells to phagocytize. So they actually secrete chemicals to destroy those worms. They also phagocytize and dispose of inflammatory chemicals, antigen-antibody complexes, and allergens from foreign antigens that trigger allergies. Then we have a basophil. And as you can see, these are very few within the total white blood cell count, 0.5 to 1% of the total count. They have a U-shaped nucleus and blue staining granules. If they move into a tissue, they are called a mast cell. They function in damaged tissues and during allergic reactions. They release histamine, which helps dilate the blood vessels to increase blood flow to the area, and they release heparin, which inhibits clot formation. So histamine is a vasodilator that widens the blood vessels, spreads the flow of blood to an injured tissue, and makes the blood vessels more permeable so that blood components such as neutrophil and clotting proteins can get into the connective tissues more quickly. Heparin is an anticoagulant that inhibits blood clotting and thus promotes the mobility of other white blood cells in the area. They also release chemical signals that attract eosinophils and neutrophils to a site of infection. Lymphocytes. These are about 20 to 25% of the total white blood cell count. They are the smallest white blood cells, and they have a spherical nucleus and no granules. They are sometimes difficult to distinguish from basophils, but remember, most basophils are conspicuously grainy, whereas the lymphocyte nucleus is uniform or merely molted. Medium and large lymphocytes are usually seen in fibrous connective tissues and only occasionally in circulating blood. There are two types: T lymphocytes, which work to attack and destroy pathogens, and B lymphocytes, which produce antibodies that attack bacteria and bacterial toxins. And then we have monocytes. These make up 3 to 8% of the total white blood cell count. They are the largest of the white blood cells, and they have a U or kidney-shaped nucleus and no granules. They function in phagocytosis of bacteria and cellular debris. Once they are in a tissue, they are called macrophages. Their nucleus is large and clearly visible. often a relatively light violet color when stained, and typically ovid, kidney-shaped, or horseshoe-shaped. The monocyte count rises in inflammation and viral infections. They go to work after leaving the bloodstream and transforming into large tissue cells, which are then called macrophages. Macrophages are highly phagocytic cells that consume up to 25% of their own volume per hour. They destroy dead or dying host and foreign cells, pathogenic chemicals, and microorganisms. They can also chop up or process foreign antigens and display fragments of them on the cell surface to alert the immune system to the presence of a pathogen. Thus, they and a few other cells are called antigen-presenting cells because they are literally presenting to other cells. Then we have platelets. They are also called thrombocytes. Platelets aren't technically cells. They are cytoplasmic fragments of megakaryocytes that have developed from the hemocytoblasts. Their concentration is 150,000 to 400,000 per millimeter cubed, and they function to plug breaks in blood vessels and begin the clotting process. So it's important to note that platelets are not cells, they are fragments. Some hematopoietic stem cells produce receptors for the hormone thrombopoietin, thus becoming megakaryoblast, cells committed to the platelet production line. The megakaryoblast duplicates its DNA repeatedly without undergoing nuclear or cytoplasmic division, and this results in a megakaryocyte, which is a gigantic cell that is actually visible to the naked eye. Most megakaryocytes live in the red blood bone marrow adjacent to the blood-filled spaces called sinusoids, which are lined with a thin, simple squamous epithelium called the endothelium. Then we have plasma. And we saw the plasma when we looked at the test tube that was spun down. And you saw the yellow fluid on the top, the straw-colored fluid portion of the blood. That is plasma. And it is 90% water. And it contains dissolved solutes and formed elements. It contains a variety of solutes that are kept in a constant state of dynamic balance. Protein is the most abundant plasma solute by weight. And plasma proteins play a variety of roles, including clotting, defense, and transport of other solutes, such as iron, copper, liquids, and hydrophobic hormones. There are three major categories of plasma proteins: albumin, globulin, and fibrogen. Albumin is the smallest and most abundant plasma protein. It serves to transport various solutes and buffer the pH of the plasma. It also makes a major contribution to two physical properties of blood: viscosity and osmolarity. Through its effects on these two variables, changes in albumin concentration can significantly affect blood volume, pressure, and flow. Globulins are divided into three subclasses, from smallest to largest in molecular weight. We have the alpha, the beta, and the gamma. Globulins play various roles in plasma transport, solute transport, clotting, and immunity. Fibrogen is a soluble precursor of fibrin, which is a sticky protein that forms the framework of a blood clot. Some of the other plasma proteins are enzymes involved in the clotting process. Your liver produces as much as 4 grams of plasma protein per hour, contributing all the major proteins except the gamma globulins. The gamma globulins come from plasma cells, connective tissue cells that are descended from the white blood cells called B lymphocytes. So albumins, 60% of the plasma proteins. They help buffer to maintain pH of blood, and they maintain osmotic pressure of blood. Osmotic pressure determines water balance between blood and cells. A decrease in the osmotic blood pressure water will move into the tissue, causing edema, which is when the tissues start to swell. And this also decreases blood volume. If you have an increase in osmotic blood pressure, water moves into the blood, causing an increase in blood volume. And this then will decrease the water in the tissues. The globulins, remember, are about 36% of the plasma protein. We have the alpha and the beta and the gamma, and they each do their own thing. So the alpha and the beta carry lipids and fat-soluble vitamins in the blood, and the gammas deal with antibodies, which are involved in immunity. Fibrogen, about 4% of plasma proteins, and this guy is vital in the role of blood clotting. It can be converted into insoluble fibrin, which helps to form blood clots. There are also some non-protein nitrogen substances, such as amino acids, which are nutrients. You also have urea and uric acid, which are waste products of protein and nucleoprotein breakdown. And these things are then excreted in the urine. The plasma also transports nutrients absorbed by the digestive tract, including glucose, amino acids, fats, cholesterol, and phospholipids, vitamins, and minerals. It transports dissolved oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen. The dissolved nitrogen normally has no physiological role in the body. Electrolytes are another important component of the blood plasma. Here they are. Electrolytes are ions absorbed from the intestine or released from cells. Some of the common ones are listed here, such as sodium, potassium, calcium. They help maintain osmotic pressure and the plasma pH. Sodium ions constitute about 90% of the plasma cations. Sodium is more important than any other solute for the osmolarity of the blood. As such, it has a major influence on blood volume and pressure. People with high blood pressure are often advised to limit their sodium intake. Electrolyte concentrations are carefully regulated by the body and have rather stable concentrations in the plasma. And that concludes this lecture.